All right. Welcome back, everybody. Now, this week, let me move my remote. Now, we're going to talk about interviews in social science, okay? So, my goal in this lecture is to demonstrate another method that's common in social science that is valuable and commonly used in environmental justice research, has, a lot of value and has easily adaptable, frameworks and approaches to a justice-centered research approach. And I'm going to use structural violence and colonialism and as like a case study where we're talking, right? So we're going to move from theory to practice. And we're going to, hopefully by the end of this, master one of social science's most fundamental tools for making the invisible visible, right? The research interview. So, again, as always, I want you to let me guide you on a thought exercise, right? So, you're trying to understand how a new protected area is going to affect a nearby community, right? And you could conduct a survey of 200 people. You could maybe get everybody in the whole community, right, to ask them how to rate their economic impact of this potential protected area on a scale of 1 to 10, right? That would give you pretty significant statistical data, power. Or you could sit down with somebody who's worked in the farming region that borders the proposed protected area for 30 years. And you could ask him to tell a story of how his relationship with the land has changed, right? That conversation might reveal interesting things, right? Gradual restrictions that have transformed not just his livelihood, but his identity, right? His family's relationships, his health, the health of his family, right? His understanding of the environment. This difference, right, between measuring variables and understanding lived experience, that's why interviews are essential for this type of research, right? Especially when we're looking at issues of environmental justice. And today I'm going to teach you, how to design and conduct interviews that can really document things that are complex and often hidden, as we talked about, like structural violence and slow violence. They're going to center community voices in a way that surveys and statistics simply cannot, right? Are surveys and statistics worthless? Absolutely not. We have a whole nother module where we're going to go into that quantitative social science, and we're going to talk about how that is incredibly powerful, and also interdisciplinary approaches that are not only social science based can support environmental justice, environmental work, and conservation work, okay? But by the end of this lecture, my goal is for you to have practical skills for conducting interviews that are going to reveal hidden power dynamics, support community advocacy efforts, and help you, get to the bottom of important questions, right? I'm going to explain different interview types, some question design strategies, some ethical approaches that make interviews rigorous and respectful, right? But of course, this is not comprehensive. There could be a whole course, and I'm sure there are, on conducting interviews, right? But this is my attempt to give you the 101 on it, right? So let's start with the fundamental question, okay? What makes an interview different from a conversation, from just having a conversation, right? And why does that difference matter for our specific context, right? So the distinction is crucial because a lot of times folks come to interviews and they think they're just going to be structured conversations, right? But research interviews are fundamentally different and they have a specific purpose and, most importantly, ethical requirements that you need to be aware of, right? In conversations, both parties are going to share information equally. You might tell your friend about, your concerns. They share theirs, right? This discussion flows naturally, and there's no predetermined agenda, right? And there are, anecdotal, ad hoc, ethnographic approaches that can, structure these non-formal conversations, right? When we talked about observational data and data collection methods and ethnography in a previous lecture, these are kind of some examples, right? But research interviews are going to involve a consent process, right? Because you're asking people to share information rather than just this mutual exchange, right? There is some extraction, but we want to make it reciprocal, right? So let me illustrate an example, right? In a casual conversation, I might ask my neighbor, how do you feel about the new planned industrial facility? And they might say, it sucks, and then change the subject, right? But in research interviews, you might ask, hey, can you walk me through your daily routine? And has that changed since the facility opened? And this question is going to open up the floor for storytelling, right? It's going to reveal specific impacts that we're interested in. And it's going to hopefully get us concrete evidence rather than just general opinions, right? Which is, again, what do we want? Systematic data supported by evidence, right? This is going to help us document and hone this out, right? Structural violence specifically operates through everyday experiences that people might not consciously connect to broader systems, especially if these are like colonial systems that have been entrenched over generations, right? Casual conversations, they might miss these connections, okay? So just take that away. But the strategic interviewing can really reveal them, right? So every technique that I'm going to show you today, it's really designed to get to these systematic investigations, right? That's going to serve these research purposes. There are many ways to conduct interviews. There are many ways to get different kinds of data from interviews, right? But I'm using, again, remember, hidden information, complex ideas as our example, okay? So don't get it twisted. This is the only way to conduct interviews, or that interviews might need to be this complex. They might not. You might ask really simple questions, right? So interviewing for environmental justice, right? Different research purposes require different interview approaches, as I just said, right? Understanding these distinctions is really going to help you choose the right method for your research questions and the specific context and needs of the participants you're working with, okay? Structured interviews, excuse me, they use the same questions in the same order with all participants. This is one of the most common types of interviews, right? This approach is really going to work well when you need standardized data for comparison, right? So let's say you're documenting health impacts, right, of a oil and gas fracking operation, right? And you're actually going to try to document these impacts across multiple communities that are infected by the pollution. The structured interview is going to ensure that you're collecting comparable information about symptoms, healthcare access, and economic costs, right? You're getting closer to that like gold standard of research findings like we talked about, right? The advantage is that the systematic data is going to enable statistical analysis, right? We don't want to discount the value of that. The limitation, though, is you have reduced flexibility, right? You're not going to be able to explore unexpected themes or maybe some deeper iterative storytelling that participants might raise, okay? You could capture that in the survey, but in terms of the systematic comparison across sites, a structured interview is not going to be able to really do that, right? Now, you might have core questions about environmental health impacts, but like as an example, if women and men are experiencing pollution differently, you can explore that gender dimension even if it wasn't part of your original research plan, because that is kind of, you can group that quite systematically. Does that make sense? So semi-structured interviews are where you have core questions that are similar in way to structured interviews, but they have flexible probing, right? So this is the most common approach in environmental justice research I conducted, semi-structured interviews, because it really balances that systematic data collection with responsiveness to participant knowledge and priorities, right? This is, again, where if you have gender differences or differences in income groups, right, you can start to identify that as you're doing interviews and starting to collect data, and you can probe those specific dimensions and ask people, can you tell me more about this specific area, right? And again, it's important to balance that consistency. You don't want to go off the rails, which can happen, but it allows you a little bit more option in the way you're interviewing, right? And life history interviews, which I don't have a lot of experience with, but this is tracing, let's say, like environmental experiences over time, right? Making them, a really powerful interview tool to document slow violence, right? So instead of asking, hey, how are things in the current conditions, you would ask participants to tell the story of the, environmental concern in their community and how this has changed over their lifetime, right? And so like you might interview an elder and you might ask them to describe how a river gradually became too polluted for fishing, how should maybe like, medicinal plant gathering disappeared as more development expanded, how climate patterns are shifting, ways that are changing cropping, right? This temporal perspective is key, right? It's going to reveal that slow violence process, and and give you that sort of like bigger picture, that snapshot in the moment. I interviewed them on this date, might miss, right? So when you're developing an interview protocol, I would recommend starting with focusing on semi-structured approaches and thinking about how you can combine systematic questioning with flexibility, and give that a go first, right? This is really going to be effective, I think, when you're starting out. It's going to be effective to achieving your research goals, and it's also really good at respecting community knowledge because you can adapt as you go and start to see how the data shapes up. So, question design. Don't ask boring questions, right? So when you're designing the questions for your survey, this is or your interview, this is different than your research questions. Don't just ask your research questions. Don't make that mistake. I do that. You can ask questions related to your research questions. You might ask it outright. You want to get deeper data, right? Effective interview design, it's going to move systematically from surface descriptions through relationship analysis to structural understanding, right? Again, that depends on what you're asking, your context. But in our context, that's what we're trying to do, right? This progression is going to be critical for documenting that structural violence, right? Because it's going to show and it's going to help participant connect individual experiences to broader systems of power that might be too complex to just hit somebody with, right? Like, tell me about your experiences in your life with structural violence, right? Folks that I interview in Thailand are not going to be able to accomplish that, right? Like, it's going to be like, what are you talking about? And most folks can't, right? It's too academic, too heady. So surface questions are not bad, right? They can establish factual foundation and build rapport, right? So what environmental changes have you noticed in this neighborhood over the past 5 years, right? This is giving them like a concrete starting point, and it's demonstrating that you value their observational knowledge, right? You're also situating them in a time scale because human recall is difficult, right? I can't even remember what I ate for breakfast most times. So you asked me, you know, do you remember what the climate was like 10 years ago? Were temperatures high or lower? No, I have no idea. Do you remember the climate was like 2 years ago? Probably still no, right? Do you remember last year? I could tell you about last year for sure, right? And so you might have to play with that, right? With your sample and the kind of questions you're asking, right? But these surface level questions are setting the stage. You're building rapport, trust. They're straightforward. They're helping to ground participants, make them feel comfortable sharing information, right? And they can get some of those, basic data or more foundational, fundamental data that can, start to generate additional concrete, analytical approaches or pathways, right? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. This is hard to do, let me tell you. So condense a lot of information into a easy to understand process. Anyway, okay, so relational questions are powerful, right? These are going to explore how different actors interact and influence each other, right? In environmental justice research, this is really important in many cases, right? So like, how did the environmental agency respond when the community raised concerns about the water quality, right? Now you're starting to see power dynamics. You're starting to see maybe recognitional justice, procedural justice, how folks were interacting and the patterns that were taking place rather than just like who had power, right? Like, how is that power actually functioning? Remember we talked about power analysis, right? Or not power mapping, different from power analysis, which is statistical, right? Here's another example, like what happened when the NGO proposed alternative solutions, right? Or how do different community groups understand the environmental problem? These questions access relationship dynamics and competing perspectives that are critical to understand environmental outcomes, okay? Right? We want to understand diverse folks, as many folks in the community. We want to design outcomes or conservation or environmental programs that are going to support as a diverse audience as possible, right? And structural questions, they're going to examine the deeper causes and constraints. These are especially applicable if we're, in our case, looking at structural violence, right? So like, why do you think compensation for environmental damage remains inadequate despite years of community advocacy, right? This invites analysis of systematic or systemic factors rather than just individual experiences, right? Again, though, you have to be careful the way you ask questions, though, because I just asked a double-barreled interview question, right? I said, why do you think compensation for environmental damage remains inadequate? One, despite years of community advocacy, right? So you also want to be careful that you're not, making these questions too complex, or in a way that the first thing you're asking is maybe going to be overshadowed by the second, or you're going to lose nuance between the two, right? Why do you think compensation for environmental damage remains inadequate? How have, how many years have you been engaging in community advocacy related to that? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think this has changed, right? Tell me more about that. See how we kind of separated that, right? So we're avoiding the muddying of our data already, right? So these structural questions and the way that I presented them, they're going to help participants articulate their understanding of power structures without just asking them to explain very complex and potentially invisible power structures, right? You have to pilot this, you have to play with this, you really have to understand the context that you're working in, okay? Really the key skill is this probing. Probing is when you're going to like dive a little bit deeper. Tell me more about that. Can you explain a little bit more? This is going to deepen your understanding without leading participants. You need to be careful about leading. You don't want to say, gosh, that sounds terrible. Can you tell me more about those negative impacts, right? Or, so you told me about the pollution. God, how much did that make, how sad did that make you, right? You're priming them. You're leading them into like a negative response, right? And it's hard not to do that because we talk about that. We empathize with folks, right? This is where this like neutrality of data collection becomes a skill you have to practice and hone, right? So like, let's say if someone mentions, the government doesn't listen, right? Don't just move on, right? Ask, okay, what does not listening look like? Can you tell me more about that? Or can you give me an example of a time when they didn't listen, right? So you're keeping it open-ended, right? You also don't want to say, so the government doesn't listen. Is that what I heard? And then they say yes. Okay, that's the end of it, right? Or asking these questions in a way that you could get a yes, no, and it could just shut it down, right? You want to kind of keep these open, again, without leading. It takes practice, right? You should practice with your interview guide. Any enumerator or person who's going to conduct your interview, you should practice with them, work through different things, play like a bad interviewee and a good interviewee, role play this out. It's really important. It might seem trivial, but you really only often have one shot at this, right? It's like Eminem, one shot. Are you going to take it? You might not have another chance to interview this person, right? And if you mess it up the first time, it can be quite awkward to interview them again and potentially even bias all your data and be inappropriate, right? You've got one shot, make it count. People are investing their time, and we're going to talk about reciprocity and ethics as we get towards the end here. But so let me again really quickly show you like a progression, right? So service question: how has flooding in your neighborhood changed over the last 3 years that you've lived here? Specific time frame, asking for recall, putting the time frame in front of them, basic question, building trust, right? Okay, interesting, right? So how have city officials responded when you reported flooding problems, right? Okay, now we're getting these relational problems. We're asking like, so yeah, like maybe they said, yeah, the city officials did nothing. So you're like, okay, well, the city officials have power, but like, tell me more about their response, right? And then structural question, right? Well, why do you think some neighborhoods are getting flood protection infrastructure while others aren't, right? So now you're kind of asking them a bigger picture, but in a tangible way where you've kind of like, you've created the understanding, the positioning of, they understand kind of what you're talking about, right? You're not leading them, but you're getting this bigger picture and you're progressing in a logical way for their brain to kind of process it and be able to talk to you in this formal way, right? So you're building. So, of course, any sort of these methods, you have to build trust and rapport. And we talked about, right, like being careful that you're not bringing your own positionality and your own power to these spaces, right? Again, you need to be critical of that here, right? Before you do any interview, if you're doing environmental justice work, you need to build trust with the community and understand that many communities have experienced extractive research, very likely, where academics collect information, but they provide no benefit to participants. And in many cases, trust needs to be repaired and earned. We're going to talk about reparative justice in future talks, and this is going to require respectful engagement, joining meetings, joining workshops, a demonstrated commitment to community goals, volunteering. You need to show folks that you're here to help, right? And you're here to make a difference and you want to understand their story, right? So before you conduct any interviews, you need to invest time learning about that context that you're working in, right? What environmental challenges is this community facing? What organizing efforts are underway? Who are the respective community leaders and gatekeepers that I need to meet? This preparation is really going to show respect, but it's also going to prevent you from asking questions that have already been asked or that are going to demonstrate right away ignorance or basic lack of understanding of community culture, right? And if your first questions out the gate, or any question really, is gonna turn somebody off or show them that you really don't know what you're talking about, right? The interview could be scrapped, right? They could be like, just gonna tell them like, yes, no, I don't know for the rest of the thing, right? If you're interviewing in a community that's been affected by industrial pollution, right? You really need to learn about the history of that pollution, right? Any legal challenges or health studies that have been conducted, current advocacy efforts, right? This background knowledge is going to enable those more informed and better probes, right? And respectful questioning, right? So, you could start by asking participants about the priorities, right? Rather than jump right into your research agenda, right? Getting to know them, right? If you don't have the opportunity to do, extensive community engagement, then do try to do this with your interview from the jump. Ask them like, hey, you've observed these environmental changes firsthand over many years. Like, that gives you knowledge that government studies often miss, right? You're validating them. You're encouraging, more detailed sharing, but you're also recognizing, the value of that experiential knowledge, right? You can also, ask them, to just kind of share what they know, right? What environmental issues are most important to you right now, right? Like, this is allowing participants to frame the conversation around their concerns, and then you can kind of build from that, and should be prepared to build from that if you're going to ask this question, right? And, be prepared to share relevant experience, right? If someone asks you about environmental regulations or health studies, you should share what you know, right? While acknowledging limitations and being careful you're not leading, but this is going to demonstrate reciprocity rather than just being like, sorry, I can't talk about that. Can you please answer my question, right? Blech. Extractive. No, thank you. And here we go again. Follow through on any commitments that you're making during interviews, right? If you promise to share findings or connect participants with resources, you better do it. Community members will remember this. They will remember when researchers made promises they didn't keep, right? And you may quickly find nobody wants to talk to you anymore, right? Not good. Not good ethical research. So consider, right? We're doing environmental justice informed research. Consider how this research can serve community advocacy efforts. This might involve, hey, I'm going to help you write a policy brief about this issue. We're going to get this in front of decision makers, right? Or, you know what? I'm going to see if I can go and testify as city, municipal government, or whatever to provide expert testimony from my findings, right? Or let's see how I'm going to work and provide my resources, my networks to connect you with some other organizations or resources that could help, get you at this meeting or help, push this thing forward, right? So don't be afraid to do that, but be sure you can follow through on it, right? So let's say, again, I'm going to quickly go through a scenario, like you're interviewing residents about an urban heat island, like we talked about, right? And instead of starting with, well, tell me about the temperature impacts, you might begin with, hey, what environmental issues are you most concerned about in your neighborhood, right? We talked about that. And then the participant might mention air quality, lack of green space, flooding. And then you're exploring their priorities, right? You could ask them specific questions that are, in your sort of flexible interview guide around those specific topics that you're curious about, right? And then this might be giving you additional color and context on how heat is intersecting with these other environmental justice concerns, right? When you ask that question, like if other neighborhoods have similar problems, you could say, or they could ask you like, hey, do you see this in other places? You could say, hey, yeah, my research shows these heat impacts are concentrated in neighborhoods with less tree cover and concrete. And this often, correlates with historical redlining patterns. Like, have you ever heard of this before, right? Again, this is demonstrating that you understand the broader patterns while respecting their specific knowledge and experiences, right? We always want to be careful that we're doing that, which leads us into, again, power, sensitivity, and ethics. My broken record of this course. I'm sure you're tired of it, but it's important, and I'll never let it go. So environmental justice interviewing is going to raise complex ethical issues because you're asking people to share information about power relationships that could affect their safety, as we already talked about with power mapping, right? So it could impact their employment, community standing. Standard research ethics will inadequately sometimes address these complexities, right? So informed consent becomes, again, complicated when potential risks vary dramatically across participants, right? A community member might face economic retaliation for criticizing local industry, while a government official might face embarrassment, right? So we need to work carefully and closely to develop different consent processes for different participant types, okay? They should focus on addressing specific vulnerabilities or risks, right? Community participants might need stronger anonymity protections, while elite participants, they might need different confidentiality arrangements, right? We just need to be thinking about this in our IRB processes. We don't want to just be ticking boxes on that ethics form, right? So ongoing consent rather than one-time approval, this can be important because environmental justice interviews, they will reveal that sensitive data, and maybe participants didn't actually anticipate sharing when they initially agreed to participate, right? So check in periodically, right? Say, is this still okay to discuss? Or like, how would you want me to handle this information? Or how comfortable do you feel, if anybody knew that you talked to me, right? So protection requires more than just removing names at the end of the day, right? In small communities, combinations of demographic details, organizational affiliations, and specific experiences can identify participants even when names are omitted, right? You have to be careful. The data, I conducted 40 interviews in a very small community, and if I mention their jobs or the leadership roles they have, someone could immediately identify who those people are, right? And they said sensitive things, right? I don't want to cause problems for them. That's completely unethical, right? You also have to be careful and think about the difference between confidentiality and anonymity, right? Do we need to be like, anonymize, make their like entire identity anonymous, right? Give them a pseudonym, obscure their demographic information, or group it in a way that we can protect individuals, right? And this might be evolving over time, right? So I think just keep this in mind. Be very careful about geographic locations, organizational types rather than specific organizations, time periods, right? And also think about someone, if you're interviewing in a small community, right? Someone might see you conducting the interview, right? So think about a comfortable space and mention like, hey, like I'm going to, and be transparent, right? I'm gonna do everything I can to protect your identity, but like we do have to be aware that if we're interviewing in public, someone might see us. Do you want to change locations to prevent this, right? So the goal is to, whenever possible, give the participants control over the sensitive information, right? Help them tell you how they feel safe and be sure that you're planning for this and adapting to it, right? And, when you think about sharing information and reciprocity, right? Ask them, right? How comfortable do you feel sharing this before I publish it or before I take it somewhere? Like, do you want to review it? Should we do member checking? What information should remain confidential? How do you feel, getting this out first, right? Reciprocity is going to mean different things. Each, different participants are going to benefit in different ways. And again, like community participants might need more concrete benefits, like a reasonable and ethical payment for their time, right? Or support with ongoing organizing efforts, right? But be honest about what you can and cannot provide, right? Don't make promises that you can't fulfill, but consider how your skills as an academic, as a researcher, as a practitioner, your institutional access, your positionality, your research findings, how they might serve participant interests beyond just getting your publication, right? Or getting your degree. It's important. Environmental justice communities or environmental justice impacted communities often are going to face these ongoing struggles that are going to extend beyond your research project, right? So consider your long-term obligations to communities that are taking their time and risking to invest in your research, right? I can tell I'm getting tired because I'm starting to make mistakes. And, I think like, think about how, let me give you another example, right? Like imagine interviewing residents about groundwater contamination, right? A participant might reveal they've experienced health problems but haven't reported them because they fear losing their job. They work at the factory, right? This information is crucial for understanding what we're after, structural violence, right? This is really good data. And how economic dependence is preventing people from protecting their health, right? This was mentioned, but sharing this information, even anonymously, this could potentially harm the participant. The company could do an investigation, they could look through health complaints, they could figure this out, right? So you might include this dynamically or this dynamic in your analysis as evidence of structural complaints without including specific details, right? That could ID the individual. We always want to be careful, like, is this data, could this ID the individual, right? The pattern, look for the pattern more than the specific case, okay? I realize this is running very long, right? So conducting the interview, right? Now we're going to get, practical. We're going to talk about how we're actually going to do it, okay? So we're looking to get rich data while maintaining that comfort and trust. And good interview conduct is going to require both strong interpersonal skills and analytical awareness, and it often has to be built and developed. Okay? Always spend time in causal conversation before beginning formal, in casual conversation before beginning formal interview questions, because this will help participants relax. It will give you a sense of their communication style so you can adapt, and it will also allow discussion of those concerns, anonymity, and anything you need to be aware of, right? It's often required through IRB, like Internal Review Board and Ethics of Conducting Social Science, but be transparent about what you're doing. I have about 8 core questions that should take roughly 45 minutes. I'm happy to follow, any directions that you want to take the conversation, but I'm going to be taking notes. Do you feel okay with that? Yes or no? Can I record? Yes or no? And explain why you're doing that. It helps me ask good follow-up questions, right? But give them control where possible, right? We can pause anytime. You need a break. If you don't want to answer a question, right, we can skip it if it's going to make you uncomfortable. And you have to honor that, right? Don't think you can go back to that question, right? And, ask them, is there anything you want to know about the research before we start? Again, this is often institutionalized. You have to do these things. But if you're working in like a practitioner sense and maybe you don't have to get some sort of review, I'm guiding you through that process, right? Active listening is key. It means paying attention, not just to content, but to emphasis. Recording and not taking notes like this is often going to help with that, okay? Think about that. Think about how you're engaging, right? If you're trying to have a conversation to make someone feel comfortable, if you're doing this the whole time, I probably wouldn't feel very comfortable, right? I hope that was clear on camera. I'm like writing. I'm like, with my head down. So maybe just record the interview and don't take any notes during, or have 2 people. One person's taking the notes, one person's conducting the interview, right? Think about the dynamics, okay? But, pay attention. You need to be paying attention to emphasis, emotion, what's not being said, right? The gaps are important. If someone mentions water quality problems with intensity, that emotional response is indicating something important. You should explore that more, right? Use strategic silence. Many of us really struggle with this, right? After participants finish responding, wait 3 to 4 seconds before asking the next question, right? This is going to generate additional information that participants are recalling or feeling comfortable or maybe searching their mind for that they can elaborate on. You're not just like, okay, next question, right? And practice your follow-up questions and make sure that they deepen your understanding rather than just trying to collect more facts arbitrarily. And make sure that you're listening so that you're not asking a follow-up that somebody's already answered. That's like one of the worst things you can do in an interview. So if someone says the city doesn't care about our neighborhood, follow up with, what does not caring look like in practice? Can you give me an example of a time when they demonstrated that lack of caring? If someone says the city doesn't care about our neighborhood, you could say, and a bad follow-up would be like, how do you feel your neighborhood's prioritized, right? Well, I just told you, they don't care. Pay attention, right? Pay attention to the nonverbal cues. They're going to indicate comfort level, confusion, sensitivity around particular topics. If you need to ask different questions or skip questions or end the interview earlier, ask for a break, right? If someone becomes quiet or shifts posture when discussing certain actors or events, that physical response is indicating something that should be explored gently but acknowledged, right? So let's say you're interviewing about environmental health, right? Impacts in a community near a petrochemical facility, right? And a participant mentions that their child has asthma. A poor follow-up, a bad follow-up. How severe is that asthma? Oof. This might make participants uncomfortable, right? And doesn't reveal what you're after, right? Better follow-up. We're talking about environmental justice, slow violence, right? Structural violence. How has dealing with your kid's asthma affected your family's, daily routine, right? This is exploring broader impacts and you're respecting their comfort. You're not probing, trying to get into medical details, FERPA, right? Even better, have other families in the neighborhood noticed similar health issues? Now we've gone into relational questions. We've moved from individual experience. We're looking for patterns. We're allowing the participant to remain anonymous and neutral, perhaps, potentially. They're sharing confidentially what they feel comfortable discussing, right? Like, here's another example. Like, I don't ever ask anybody, would you kill an elephant? Well, of course they're going to say no, right? But if you say, do you know anybody who's killed an elephant? What do other people think about killing an elephant, right? Anyway. End interviews by asking if there's anything important you haven't discussed. Always do this. Is there anything about environmental issues in your community that we haven't talked about that you think is important? This is where some of the best data comes from. Okay? That's where some of the best answers come from. I don't know why. I'm sure there's a reason based in human psyche, but do it. And then discuss the next steps clearly, right? Okay, hey, our team is going to be analyzing these interviews over the next months. So we'll be in touch. But would you like me to share a summary of what I find? How would you prefer I contact you? Do you want to see these results? Is there any timelines that would be important for you, right? Be polite. You're here to help, right? And provide clear contact information and realistic availability, right? If this person thinks of something else they want to share, they have questions about research, they can contact you, right? Sometimes they want to follow up once they feel a little bit braver and they want to share more, right? Or they leave there and they're like, oh, I wish I had said that thing, right? Give them your contact information if you feel comfortable, right? Protect yourself, protect your own identity as well. So, life history interviews, again, I don't know if we have time to go too in depth on this, but again, they're very powerful for documenting slow violence because they're going to reveal how that environmental justice develops gradually over time periods that other research and even traditional interviews are not going to hit at, right? You're going to get that generational knowledge, right? And that temporal approach, temporal data is so good, and it's going to reveal a clear sort of perhaps cascade or relationship that would really support a case to show how this is impacting a community over long periods of time, right? So I would say I'm going to skip a little bit through my notes through this, but in life history interviews, you're gonna get a lot of data and it's gonna be a lot of storytelling, but you're always gonna be looking for patterns, right? You're always gonna be asking questions that are gonna try to allude to broader patterns, right? Again, try not to focus on current conditions. And you do have to kind of practice this to keep people on track and keep people, because asking somebody about long periods of time, my gosh, these can go really long. You can get into a lot of details, right? So if you have interest in this, reach out via email or office hours. We can talk more about this, but unfortunately, I don't have time to go too deep into life history interviews, but very interesting methodology, right? So I really want to talk quickly about this, which I think is really important. It's digging deeper ethically, right? And accessing what is called hidden transcripts or hidden messages. So James Scott, one of my favorite philosophers, social scientists, justice scholars, he had, really explored this concept of hidden transcripts and really posits that it's crucial for environmental justice interviewing. Okay, so hidden transcripts are the private critiques, resistance strategies, and authentic perspectives that people develop but rarely express publicly. They are especially to researchers, right? They might perceive them as connected to power structures, right? So public transcripts are going to be the safe, socially acceptable responses that are not going to challenge existing power arrangements, right? This is going to be most common, right? People are not going to put themselves at risk. They don't know you in many cases, right? So when discussing pollution from a major local employer, they might say, look, we understand the industry provides jobs and we've learned to adapt to some environmental challenges, okay? The hidden transcript might include sophisticated analysis of this environmental racism, critiques of regulatory failure, and community strategies for protection that public discourse is not going to acknowledge or be able to get to, right? The same person might privately say, well, that company is poisoning us and the government let them get away with it. It's because they don't care about poor communities, right? That's gold, right? Accessing these hidden transcripts is going to require indirect questioning techniques because people may not trust you with politically sensitive perspectives, right? Especially if they fear retaliation. So use third person questions, like I just told you about elephant killings, right? Rather than direct challenges to authority, instead ask, well, do you think environmental agencies treat your community unfairly? Or, what do other community members say about environmental agencies when officials aren't around? So you're not asking them, what else do you hear, right? People love to gossip. Gossip is powerful. It can tell you a lot, right? They're going to share those critical perspectives maybe more easily, while maintaining that social distance from that potentially risky statement, right? So they can tell you what others think while they're protecting themselves, right? Classic strategy, very effective. Hypothetical scenarios can create safe space for criticism, right? So you could say, well, hey, if you were in charge of environmental policy for this area, what would you do differently, hypothetically? This is going to frame critique as constructive alternatives rather than direct challenges, but also think about your culture, because I can tell you from example, in Thailand, where I conduct most of my research, hypotheticals do not work. They're not a thing. It just doesn't translate, right? So it's not effective and it confuses people, right? So think about that, right? Historical comparison can also provide emotional distance from those sensitive topics, right? So how did you hear the community deal with environmental problems, before the current policies were implemented, right? You're giving them distance, right? You're asking them about the policy change and how that is shaping over time and shapes their current positions, right? They're going to give you that current position maybe in that space, right? But in, you know, here's an example, right? Like in urban environmental justice context, right? A hidden transcript might include analysis of how environmental racism operates through zoning decisions, how community organizing strategies navigate political realities, or how families are protecting their children from environmental hazards, right? But reading into these hidden transcripts, it really requires attention to context, tone, and indirect communication, right? You need to practice this and you need to be very careful that you don't bias or assume data that's not there, right? When someone says, we learned to just accept the situation, this might express resigned powerlessness, strategic adaptation, or quiet resistance, or they might have just learned to accept the situation. Difficult, complex, right? You have to find the patterns. You have to find the patterns. You have to look for the relationships. You have to find the evidence that's supporting this across multiple dimensions, right? Remember we talked about mapping the power, doing observational frameworks, right? You have to support these things. You cannot just go off isolated statements, right? But this might emerge in recurring themes through thematic analysis and qualitative analysis, right? Across different participants. You need to do triangulation and don't use explicit statements in this approach, but be careful how you represent this, like I just said, and be careful how much you probe on this, right? It's, don't violate ethics, right? It might not, the information shared might not be good for public dissemination, right? You need to develop protocols on how you're going to protect that information and be careful and aware of that the entire time, right? So interview data analysis, right? Interview data systematically. We talked about qualitative analysis. This is more about how you're going to unpack your interview data in like a practical sense. But so we're not going to go into qualitative data analysis or like the actual meat and potatoes of data analysis. But again, with interviews, the goal is to extract evidence about the structural violence. In our case, power relationships. We're not just looking for people's opinions, right? So our friend, the reflexive memo, is back here. Write down reflexive memos within 24 hours of each interview while your memory remains fresh. You're going to include content summaries, but also emotional, analytical observations, contradictions. What questions did you wish you had asked? What is already kind of unclear for you, right? Document those emotional responses, nonverbal cues, defensive behavior about particular topics, right? And you can use interviews to inform later ones. This is iterative learning, right? So you can, if multiple participants in these early stages of the interview are mentioning something, an organization or event, then you could develop specific questions for those themes to ask other people in those interviews, right? Now you have to think about like how important is systematic data collection to you, but right, you can do that sort of iterative building up to a point, right? You don't want to be doing that towards the last interviews, right? Because you're trying to you have to triangulate, right? So you're trying to keep asking as many people as possible the same questions, right? So you can do that in the early stages, but don't let it go past the midpoint. Focus on your coding categories specifically for what you're looking at. Again, don't make it too generic. We talked about power relationships and looking for those patterns, all the different coding strategies you could take about community knowledge and resistance, looking for contradictions. Again, we talked about this, right? And then cross-interview analysis, right? Compare those perspectives. This is triangulation 101, right? And try to bring in some maybe additional data sources to explore some things people are talking about, right? So digital tools for interviews, obviously, like recording options is really good. It's going to enable precise quote documentation. You should always be trying to interview, right? You need specific permissions for that. They need to consent. You cannot record without their knowledge. My God, don't do that, right? They need to know you're doing this, right? But this is so important because then you can go back and you can listen to the interview, right? And you can transcribe it and you can go back and say, oh, what did they say, right? Because again, you don't want to be doing this during the interview, just taking notes the whole time, right? So audio recording is going to be very, very valuable, right? But it might inhibit people from feeling comfortable talking about things if they feel like they're going to be on the record, right? Again, note-taking, be strategic about this. Some participants are going to prefer to talk when you're not taking notes or recording. You got to roll with it, right? And you need to start thinking about that as you're structuring your methods, right? Video calling, you could record the video. You could, many different ways. Transcription is how you're going to like, transcribe what the interviewer said. So there's lots of AI tools and other tools that are going to help you to do this, but you really need to do it manually and you have to check it, right? So you're going to like have the recording of the interview, you're going to listen to it, and you're going to use the AI tool to transcribe it to the best of its ability. And then you're going to listen and you're going to go through and check line by line, making edits and ensuring that everything is 100% right. Again, this is giving you that what? Familiarization of the data, okay? Think about that. We could talk more about that in office hours if you do want to practice some of this. Again, think about quality. Make sure that you're doing things systematically, so you don't have to repeat work. In Vivo, these tools can help you do your analysis. But choose tools that are based on your technical skills, right? Budget constraints. You don't need like the most advanced stuff to do some of this stuff. Simple tools have been used throughout history for this. Again, always prioritize participant comfort over technical conveniences for you. I know that's tough, but you can't put people in an uncomfortable position, right? If having the laptop out is going to make somebody feel uncomfortable, then you might need to rethink how you're going to take notes. And you must think about data security, right? You have to like protect this data, right? Be sure that it can't get hacked, it can't get stolen, it can't be leaked by accident, right? Like you could be in big trouble if that happens, right? So local storage, encryption, locking cars, locking file cabinets, right? Consider how this is going to affect and prevent any sort of data leakages that could happen. So again, putting this all together into a practical guidance for interview protocols, right? So again, it all comes back to the research question, right? You must have a clear research question that's going to connect what you're looking to get to and your analyses, right? You must have that, right? Show how the methods and your integration, right? Show how the interviews are going to complement other research methods that you might use, right? If you're going to plan to use ethnographic observation, explain which specific power dynamics the interviews will reveal that the observations cannot, right? If you're going to be looking at policy documents, explain how the interviews will reveal, implementation realities, things like that, right? You must really, really think carefully about designing participant selection that's going to get a diverse perspective of the same, phenomenon you're seeking to study, right? Diverse community members, snowballing, different insights, right? This is critical. Again, chart out and make a specific plan about how you're going to build trust. How will you learn from the community context before you conduct the interviews, right? What reciprocity are you going to offer participants? How will you ensure benefits rather than just taking things from the community, just taking data, right? Be realistic about that and be realistic about access limitations, right? Because you're not going to be able to go everywhere. Not everybody's going to talk to you, right? Elite actors may require formal requests that you're not going to be able to get, right? So again, just be reasonable and plan and double plan, right? Always show systematic progression, right? Develop sequences that are going to move from surface description through relationships through that analytical structure, especially trying to get to structural issues, right? Think about that. Think about how that's going to evolve, right? Think about, do I need to bring in temporal elements? Do I need to be asking people about their historic memory? What is the time frame, right? Do I need to be probing to get deeper questions, right? Put all this together and then double check it, triple check it, 300% check it with your ethical framework, right? How am I protecting people? How do different people need to be protected, right? How do I maintain community accountability, reciprocity, quality indicators, all of this stuff, right? This is all stuff you need to be thinking about. So these are old slides from the other presentation that I didn't delete. So yes, so again, we're going to go into future modules about more like community-based approaches and maybe more like community-based participatory interviewing and some other strategies like queue sorting and some other, kind of innovative systems. But, interviews are a powerful tool. They can, be transformative for people and can create really transformative data. But you got to be careful about how you're doing it, right? So practice makes perfect. I have now given you the basic practical skills, but it is up to you to hone these skills. So I'm looking forward to how you apply these in your final project if you're going to discuss your methods or what you're going to be working on. Again, remember the goal isn't just demonstrating technique, right? But you're designing research that could genuinely contribute to more just and effective environmental outcomes, right? So now go to your assignments, practice these skills, design an interview protocol. Why not, right? Try it out. And then, always reach out with questions, email or office hours. I'm always there for you. Awesome. Take care.